Hi, everybody. We are going to wait for maybe one more minute before we get started, just to let the room populate. We have a great topic today, and I'm very excited to have our guests. Let's see. If you feel like it, why don't you put your profession in the chat box? And that we'll see who's here. As far as, everybody who's represented, since it's the professional webinar. Oh, there's some good ones. Of course, some landscape architects, botanical garden director, contractors, DAX people, master gardeners, archaeobotanists. I've actually never asked this question before, a webinar before, so it's super interesting to see who's here and what you all do. All right, I will start in the interest of time and respecting your time. My name is Jen Marvin. I'm the education coordinator here at the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. This is our professional webinar that we have once a month, generally on the second Tuesday of every month. However, next week is Veterans Day, so we decided to move it up just a week. Today's webinar is creating habitat connectivity with urban landscape. We have Isabella Guttuso Browne and Michael Volk, and they're going to tell you all about this wonderful topic. Just a few housekeeping things. Your microphones will be muted. We will be closing the chat feature during the presentation. Please put any questions that you have during the presentation into the Q&A box, not the chat box. And we will have a question and answer session right after the presentation. This webinar is approved for one FFLCP, LIAF, FDAX, which includes LF, LCLM, LLO, and CLO categories. DBPR has approved it for one LA credit, one CAM, Community Association Manager credit, counts for one credit for FNGLA and one for AICP if we have any planners with us today. There's a $15 administration fee to receive the certificate for this morning's continuing education. And as soon as we start the presentation, I will put that link into the box, the chat box, so you can make the payment for the certificate if you've not already done so. And we're aware that the landscape architecture renewal deadline is by the end of the month. So we will put those in as soon as possible. And you will also get a certificate emailed to you, hopefully by the end of this week. We will submit the CEUs to the licensing agency if you are not a self-reporter. And we'll try to do that by Friday, so make sure your payment is made by the end of today. This is, again, part of a monthly webinar series held on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. I'm sorry, the second Tuesday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Our next webinar will be on December 9th with Dr. Dave Clark, and he'll be speaking about his Coleus program. So with that, Isabella and Dr. Volk, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate the introductions, and I'm glad that everyone's here today. We're excited to talk about this topic, and we're really, trying to talk about and weave through the science and the planning frameworks that help us think about wildlife connectivity from the state and regional level down to the small scale and local level, and how these pieces all fit together. So we're going to talk about green infrastructure across the scales, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, design within the rural to urban gradient, and then really kind of finish off with this topic of urban green infrastructure and habitat connectivity. But before we jump in, I want to introduce myself and let Mike introduce himself. My name is Isabella, and I'm the Urban and Recreational Green Infrastructure Coordinator at the University of Florida in the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning. And my background is in landscape architecture, and my work and applied research focuses on how urban green infrastructure, things like parks, stormwater infrastructure, native landscapes, recreation, can support both communities and connect us to our local green networks and regional conservation systems. And I'll let Mike introduce himself next.
Yeah, thanks, Isabella, and great turnout today. It looks like we have 142 people so far, so excited about that. I'm the associate director of the University of Florida Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, and we'll provide a little bit more information about that. But along with Isabella, I help run our urban and recreational green infrastructure work, and I also handle a lot of the boring stuff that nobody else wants to do, like budgets, all of those fun things. Um, so the center we're within the College of Design, Construction, and Planning, and the Department of Landscape Architecture specifically. We were founded in 2010 um, by Dr. Tom Hochter and myself, and the center's primary goal is to conduct applied research on the relationship between conservation and land use. And as it says here on the slide, we really have sort of four key programmatic areas that we work within. Really, the foundation of the center's work was and it still is regional statewide conservation planning, especially focused on statewide connectivity and biodiversity priorities, and working with state and federal and local agencies to identify the highest priorities for land protection. We also work with directly on land protection projects with partners throughout the state, including land trusts and NGOs. We have the work that Isabella and I are primarily engaged with, which is focused on green infrastructure design at the community and the recreational levels. But we also have staff that are focused on linear infrastructure design, including the impacts and the relationship between roads, utility corridors, trails, et cetera, on biodiversity and ecology. And then the other really important piece of what we do is focused on communicating the science. And of course, we're within a university system, so we have a significant educational component to what we do, but this also includes communicating the science to the public through events, education, exhibitions, and other strategies, webinars like this. So, yeah, go ahead, Isabella. And we mentioned the Urban Green Infrastructure Initiative at the beginning. Really, what I see this as is work that is trying to making the connection between the regional and statewide work that the center does, and making a connection between that and recreational and community design, and the specific things that a lot of the people on the call today, here today, are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today, and part of the way we're going to structure this presentation. So, as it says, our mission is to conduct applied research on several topics, including the role of green infrastructure in increasing resiliency, providing ecosystem services, or the things that ecosystems provide that benefit humans in different ways, maximizing ecological function in both developed landscapes as well as within areas outside of core developed areas within the urban to rural interface. We have several research objectives that are listed on the slide below. So we're working across a number of different topics and facets and areas to work directly with partners to address these issues. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. So to get into it, you've seen this term come up multiple times already. What is green infrastructure? So green infrastructure is a broad term, and it's really what we use to describe how we integrate natural and semi-natural systems into land use planning and engineering and urban design. And so this term covers this whole spectrum from large intact landscapes, natural landscapes, on one end to the other end of the spectrum, which is our more highly engineered systems like permeable pavement or rain barrels or rain sisters on the other side. And so between these two are these more designed systems that blend both these natural and built features, things like rain gardens and our bioswales or living shorelines, urban street canopies and native landscaping. And at its core, the purpose of green infrastructure is to sustain natural processes and the ecological functions that in turn provide ecosystem services, benefits like clean water and flood protection, other things we'll talk about in a little bit, but in essence are providing for the well-being of both people and wildlife. And so just as there's a spectrum from natural built systems within green infrastructure, there's also a spectrum across scale, from the site to the community to the regional scale. So kind of working from the bottom up here at the site scale first, this is really about green infrastructure we can, kind of simplify it to thinking about the parcel level or project-based work. So things like, again, rain gardens or green roofs, or how we landscape our projects, or the types of interventions that we see in yards or commercial sites, things like this. And then we bump it up to the community scale. So we're looking at then expanding into more systems that are knitting together our neighborhoods, things like our parks or our urban forests and greenways, or our urban waterways, or even our green streets. And then at the regional scale, it's really about thinking about connecting these communities into the larger ecological fabric. So this is about natural landscapes, our working lands like ranches and timberlands and agriculture. We'll talk about that in a little bit with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Also like major watershed systems that sustain and protect our more urban areas. And so each scale builds on the other. And together they create, in hopes, this multi-layered network that supports ecosystem function and resilience no matter where you are across this, kind of built to natural spectrum. And so one way that we describe the value of green infrastructure is through ecosystem services, which is the benefits that people and also wildlife receive from nature, but we usually classify, in the way that people receive these benefits. And these tend to fall into 4 general categories. Provisioning services, these are like goods and materials that we obtain like food and water. Regulating services, so things like flood control, air purification. Cultural services, so our recreation, our heritage, our sense of place and culture within the and how that's influenced from the landscape. And then supporting services, which is really the focus of this topic or this presentation, and also the underlying process for all other services, because it's about really the habitat that makes all of the others possible. And so scale is important here when we think about our small and local projects. These, like, say like a native garden or a vegetated pond, these provide ecosystem services. However, the more that they're interconnected or broader scale, the more benefit that they can provide to our human communities as well as natural communities. And so then when we think about, beyond the individual project at an individual scale, we can start to see how these pieces can connect into what we call a green infrastructure network, which is essentially in this interconnected system of natural areas and open spaces that sustain these ecosystem functions and provide these co-benefits for people and wildlife. And at the regional scale, we can think about these as, or the pieces as a system of hubs, links, and sites. So hubs are these anchored green infrastructure pieces that provide habitat for native plants and animal communities. So these are things like, again, beyond kind of the urban scope, there are large protected areas, wildlife refuges, management areas, parks, forests. And then the links are the corridors that tie these hubs together. And these often interweave into our urban landscape, greenways and waterways, and other like park or linear spaces in between. And then sites, these are these can be kind of like spin-offs from the main systems, or they can be isolated in actuality, but even if they're isolated or not physically connected, it's still important in the overall framework of providing these services. And this kind of green infrastructure network framework guides a lot of our conservation and planning work at the center. Specifically, it's very relevant when we think about our regional statewide green infrastructure network, which we call the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, and it's the foundation for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which might be a term you're more familiar with. So again, we're thinking right now, big picture, statewide natural green infrastructure. So the Florida Ecological Greenways Network is managed and has it was created by Tom Hochter and others at the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning at UF. And like I said, it forms the foundation of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. It's broken up. So this is what it looks like spatially across the state of Florida, but it's broken up into these 5 priorities. And so priority 1 is the highest. We call these the critical linkages, and they're the essential corridors that complete a functional statewide network. So without these, these are our priority. These are super important. But we do have priority 2, which are essentially the buffers to expand on those linkages and offer some alternative corridors in case of pinch points, are basically like breaks in the priority 1 system. And then priority 3, provide those significant alternative routes. Priority 4 is our other important riparian corridors or regionally significant opportunities for other large intact landscapes across the state. And then priority 5 are all of the other intact landscapes that might also provide protection within a statewide ecological corridor. And as I mentioned, this is the foundation for what we know as the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is just composed of the first 3 or the top 3 priorities of the network. And this is really a great example of, obviously statewide connectivity, but also the political will and momentum behind actually protecting this network. We have bipartisan support and funding for the acquisition of conservation lands for the protection of a lot of the rural working landscapes, the ranchlands and timberlands that make this connection possible. But because of that, it's a goal, it's a vision, it's not a 100% connected landscape as of now. So this is really more what it looks like. We have 18 million acres in the corridor, but 7.7 million of those is still unprotected. And so its connectivity is not guaranteed, it's an active process. And the reason why we wanted to, obviously we're talking about urban connectivity for this presentation, but we wanted to lead with this, not just because it's a main focus of the center, but it really does connect it down to our urban system. And so concepts of connectivity that come from principles of conservation biology and landscape ecology, specifically reserve design and ecological corridors, offer this framework for how we understand and why maintaining connections between habitat patches is essential for sustaining our wildlife populations and ecological processes that support them. And so this is a conservation strategy, again, at the statewide scale, but we can apply these concepts to connectivity planning at the urban and community scale as well. And it's important to understand these in the concept of green infrastructure. So going back to the FEGN, you may have noticed in the map that our major cities, Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, Southeast Florida, etc., they fall outside of the network, not even within priority 5. And that's not because they're unimportant. It's because the FEGN identifies really those high priority opportunity areas for a statewide ecological network. But that doesn't mean that there's not many other areas in these, in these gaps that don't play vital roles in supporting local corridors and providing ecosystem services, protecting biodiversity. It just means that within our urban communities, we have an opportunity to plan local green networks and strengthen that local connectivity and connect to this broader statewide system for both people and wildlife. So a great example of this is the Lake Wales community of Florida. They put together a project called the Lake Wales Envisioned Project, which was a community-driven kind of vision that integrates both conservation and growth planning into their future land use. And so on the left, you're seeing just kind of a screenshot from one of our online tools for looking at the corridor. It's called the EcoCon viewer. And the city of Lake Wales is in this gap, but there's some priorities around it. But in this Lake Wales Envision project, you see their big and little green infrastructure network that has these linear green spaces that connect all the way into their dense urban core. And so they're really trying to identify in this project how existing conservation lands can connect down to the neighborhood scale. And then they can guide development around compatible locations and patterns to protect that. And so they're ensuring that their local parks, their wetlands, and their natural areas are connected to this broader ecological system while managing that infill and growth responsibly. And so what's really powerful here is the coordination of regional and local data. So they used sources from and we provide a lot of data on this site called FGDL. And they also use sources from the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, or FNAI, and some of our center zone like mapping tools to understand how biodiversity, water, and other priorities intersect across the scale. And so, yeah, so our website, as well as FGDL and FNA, are great resources for sourcing that kind of regional scale data, but then looking at your municipal and local data to further understand local priorities is really important too. And they did a great job in this project of really making that clear throughout their planning process. Okay, so now we're going to transition a little bit to the planning and design within the rural to urban gradient. So it's useful to think about this rural to urban gradient when thinking about wildlife connectivity. And this transect really underpins what the form-based codes are for defining the physical and ecological characteristics at each point along this gradient. And so when it comes to habitat connectivity as a goal, focusing on the corridor is, of course, always the highest priority, but what happens at each point along the urban to rural transect directly impacts the success of the corridor. And that might seem strange, like, well, what happens in the urban zone? How does that manage, how does that impact what happens in the corridor? Well, these are some kind of big picture points as to how that happens. What happens in the urban zone is, and especially this rural fringe beyond it, plays this critical role because it's where development and sprawl is moving into our urban areas. If we can absorb some of that growth into our infill and redevelopment in urban areas, it takes that that pressure off of our more rural or corridor areas. And so at the center, we're often trying to reinterpret, or reframe some of these existing tools we have, like the transect, to think about it through the conservation lens, how to keep rural lands rural or guide compatible development where appropriate, and think about how we can enhance livability and ecological function in our urban areas for a better urban to rural fabric overall. And so this kind of coordination is key. We want to align local land use planning with our regional conservation goals for the better of everyone. And so in this framework, for example, the pink areas represent what would be like an urban growth zone. So places where infill and redevelopment and adaptive reuse and increasing density where appropriate are prioritized. And so these areas are where we would want to say accommodate growth while reducing sprawl pressures. And then the gold area represents a zone which would be the limited growth zone. So often rural or semi-natural lands where infrastructure and services are already in place, but where we want to maintain landscape character and ecological function in that rural setting. So a strategy in here to protect connectivity would be like conservation subdivisions or cluster development that can, if appropriately sited, allow for some growth while still preserving a large connected space, which in this sense is established through identifying existing conservation areas and where we want to identify a local corridor opportunity zone and the green infrastructure to really support that over, say, linear infrastructure like an existing roadway to meet that goal. And this is all really important because when we look at our existing development footprint in the state, we do see some some clashing with our regional or urban connectivity, or sorry, regional connectivity goals. But when we look at developed future land use, we see even more conflict. And so the purpose here is to really show that even in our comprehensive planning and future land use, our planning is not perfect, and there's conflict that we can resolve to really meet our statewide conservation goals. And this is really why that idea of good urban planning is good rural planning and vice versa is critical to set up this conversation about habitat connectivity in the urban landscape. So now we're going to transition to, again, thinking about this transect, this more urban zone, and thinking in this context where ideally we want to try to accommodate growth, reduce sprawl pressure, and at the same time enhance livability for people and wildlife. And expanding the use of green infrastructure strategies is really a key tool to do this. So shifting to this now, the urban green infrastructure network. In this context, we're really thinking about connectivity being improved through redevelopment and infill, and integrating green space and habitat into new projects, and retrofitting, so adding green infrastructure to existing infrastructure. So how do we look at new and existing projects to kind of build this resilient, and connected system? The main challenge for maintaining these natural system connectivities in cities generally falls into three categories, which is fragmentation, reduced environmental quality, and then other environmental stressors. So fragmentation happens when these green spaces are often isolated or missing between, parcel to parcel, as of course, is expected in our urban areas. We see large gaps in our uplands or channelized waterways, or, restricted coastal areas that don't really have a great buffer between the water, the ocean or the Gulf, and then the built infrastructure. And then for the quality, that's, often our waterways are heavily altered. They might lack a littoral zone or a natural planted edge. Even our park spaces might not really have that vegetation diversity to provide, food resources, shade, cover for species. And then other environmental stresses to think about are things like light and noise pollution, vehicular traffic and movement, pet and human interactions with wildlife, and then issues of resiliency, so heat, stormwater management, and how all of these issues can compound off of fragmentation and the quality of the habitat. But green infrastructure provides a way to address these challenges, specifically by reducing fragmentation, enhancing quality, and mitigating some of these stressors. So to reduce fragmentation, we create or strengthen linkages between parks, waterways, and open spaces. For example, daylighting or restoring riverine systems in the urban landscape, developing greenways that connect existing green nodes, or something as simple as street trees or corridors with more complete streets that have bioswales and more native tree canopy and other vegetated elements of the landscape. And to enhance quality, we can diversify our plant palette with native species, provide layered protection for food and shelter, restore littoral edges, and ultimately, when possible, restore a more upland to wetland transition. And so really the goal here is to give urban green spaces room to breathe and function more like ecosystems, and not just in a restricted kind of bubble. And to address stressors, these same strategies help manage urban heat, address and treat stormwater runoff, buffer noise and light pollution through specific design strategies. And I mean, that could be its whole presentation in itself. And I know, a lot of you are landscape architects that know these specific pieces. And so hopefully, these are the little things that connect to this bigger concept of what we're talking about. And speaking about that big concept again, so thinking about habitat connectivity and how this relates back to corridor protection and like landscape ecology and reserve design and these sorts of things, there's two kind of main pieces that I thought were really relevant to kind of go back to that concept of it, which was structural connectivity and functional connectivity. And structural connectivity refers to the physical arrangement of our green and blue spaces, like what it looks like on a map, where functional connectivity is really about how those spaces are performing ecologically, like from wildlife perspective. Do they have what they need to move, to feed, to reproduce, like those key elements and species needs? And so urban green infrastructure, as we've discussed, can strengthen both of these. We can work on integrating actual connections, but also providing stepping stone habitats that also function for connectivity in the urban landscape. And so this is kind of thinking about that corridor concept from a regional scale, but making it relevant to the urban scale. And these are sort of the pieces that we can think of in that framework. So one way to think about how all these ideas come together in urban planning and strategy is what we call often this emerald necklace concept. And the emerald necklace is a project in Boston, Massachusetts, that was originally a project of Frederick Law Olmsted, who is, one would say the father of landscape architecture. And he's designed through this obviously very urbanized landscape, or urbanizing at the time that he just developed it, was designed to link various upland habitats, meadows and woodlands, with wetlands and waterways, riverine systems into one cohesive connected park that not only solved some urban troubles like mitigating stormwater, pollution into the waterways, but also provided equitable public access to nature, and on top of that, providing habitat connectivity throughout a now very urbanized city. And so when we think about these hubs and links and sites and these, kind of like key corridors and linear landscapes, this is a way of kind of framing it, where we have major parks as the jewels of an emerald necklace, green corridors as the chain, and then these other stepping stones, which are maybe not connected, but equally as important in the urban landscape. And this model, this park, has really inspired many other communities throughout the United States and beyond. This is just to kind of use this framework of connectivity in their own green infrastructure planning. This is just one that I personally love. It's the Los Angeles Emerald Necklace, and they took this concept of from the mountain to the sea. And so they looked at their national forests and then their situation between that upland system and their coastline, and looked at riverine systems as a way to, make those linear connections. But common goals across many other Emerald Necklace projects are, to link these major hubs with local corridors, to fill the gaps with accessible green infrastructure, and then to restore ecological function, through those methods. And on top of that, obviously this conversation is about wildlife connectivity, but we can't ignore the fact that these provide so many benefits, for multi-benefits for public infrastructure, for equitable access to nature, for so many other ecosystem services that benefit us as a community as well. So building an urban emerald necklace for wildlife connectivity, some public and private action items. This is not exhaustive in the least, but it's a way to start thinking about what the role of the public sector and the private and community action or sector can be. And so in the public sector, some actions might include, you know, at the core, when we go back to like the Lake Wales envisioned concept, how do we identify and protect these key ecological hubs and corridors that surround our urban landscapes, in our comprehensive plans, in our policy, and how do we retrofit our existing infrastructure, create new infrastructure to not only, you know, create these connections within our urban realm, but really connect out to those large hubs as well. You know, there's also the importance of developing resources and demonstration sites to encourage private participation of these types of projects. And of course, our, you know, our partners with CLU and IFAS do a lot of this work through their extension work. And, you know, in all the communities across the state of Florida. And then private and community actions, of course, there's, you know, like I said, stepping stones are just as important. So enhancing yards, our shared spaces with native landscaping and habitat features like our rain gardens, our bioswales, you know, just biodynamic landscapes is so important. And we'll talk about an example here in a second as to why. Trying to reduce through our design strategies, light, noise, and chemical pollution. And then thinking in collaboration. So how can we partner with our neighbors or HOAs or you know, other community members to extend habitat connections between our properties, between our communal spaces. And connectivity really succeeds when this public and private landscape works together as part of the same system. And so a lot of these Emerald Necklace projects have really emerged because of public investment and private stewardship across the scale, from from the site neighborhood to regional, and then from, you know, kind of like that core urban landscape all the way to the rural. And so one, you know, just quick example here, and then I'm going to give Mike a chance to talk about a different example, is about pollinator habitats and how, you know, the big point is really that different species have different needs. And we need to have an understanding of what those are in general, you know, to kind of identify the specific pieces that are needed. But for pollinators specifically, the more stepping stones, the better. And yes, we have these kind of sites that we know are important, like road right-of-ways or greenways and parks, as well as residential yards and community spaces that we can enhance for pollinator habitat. But knowing the species needs is really the most critical. So for our native bee species or other pollinators, knowing what types of host plants they might need, the management of the plants and the landscapes, the landscape management strategies to protect the resource that they need, whether that's in how we're managing the plant or what type of nesting and shelter we're providing. This is all, you know, this kind of goes down to the smallest level, but this graphic that Kelly Quinn with Canvas of the Wild developed really is a beautiful way of showing that, like, you know, all it takes is 1 yard and then the neighbor to do something and your other neighbor to do something, and thinking about that as it expands beyond that, that's what really creates a network, a stepping stone network, to say the least. And this photo is actually a great example of that demonstration of why this is important, from the IFAS County Extension location in Orange County and their pollinator garden, as well as other gardens that they have to show how to do this. So then thinking a little bit bigger picture, in a more interconnected wetlands or, you know, riparian system, I'm going to let Mike talk a little bit about the Sweetwater Branch watershed.
Yeah, thanks, Isabella. When we were thinking about this, we were thinking about looking at connectivity from an upland perspective, as well as a riparian or hydrologic perspective. And this is an example of a project that some of you may be aware of if you visited Gainesville or lived in Gainesville, but that we do at least one student tour of each year, probably more. I inherited this tour from other people that were wiser than I am and that had already been part of this for a long period of time. But the Sweetwater Branch watershed is an urban watershed within the city of Gainesville that runs through the historic downtown, actually begins just north of downtown in the historic neighborhood of the Duck Pond neighborhood. And then it connects to ultimately the Alachua Sink, where where it's one of the sinks that allows water back into the aquifer that we use for water supply in the city. So it's a great example of thinking about the role of historic urban development patterns and stormwater patterns, including runoff from roadways and parking lots on an urban creek system. And as a result of essentially the lack of runoff control over time, because the regulations weren't in place when this part of the city was developed, the watershed has become contaminated with fecal coliform, nutrient contamination, et cetera, and was included in a larger, what we call a BMAP, or a Basin Management Action Plan, for addressing this contamination through a series of strategies. Some of these might be, um, you know, regulatory strategies or incentive-based strategies. Others were specific infrastructure improvement projects. And they also included new parks and infill and redevelopment projects throughout the watershed, but at a series of points, really trying to look at what the urban fabric looked like in each one of these cases and how we can improve water quality. And so issues that are experienced by the creek include obviously increased water runoff. So that's increasing velocity, volume of water, the pollutants. And one of these projects was near the top of the watershed, the restoration of at least part of the stream corridor that's visible at this point, that's daylighted, to increase the serpentine form of it, to slow the water down, to restore the banks in terms of the gradient, and to replant them. And at this point, that part of the project has aged, so it probably still requires some ongoing maintenance. But it was a conversion of a existing concrete channel to restore that creek within that portion. And go ahead, Isabella, to the next slide. Other projects within the watershed included restoring a historic brownfield site, Depot Park, which is just south of downtown, to remediate the brownfield contamination. It was a coal gasification plant, but then also to provide a urban park where it has become really a gathering place and a core downtown, and to manage stormwater from new downtown redevelopment projects that have to manage the stormwater that they produce as part of that redevelopment. Well, there's not enough space downtown because of the density of the development. So that gets sent to this urban stormwater park so that they're still meeting those state stormwater requirements. The Sweetwater Wetlands Park is an additional project near number 7 at the base of the watershed, where again, they're taking all the water that flows out of that creek. And originally that was just run through, well, not originally, but in the 20th century, most of the 20th century, that ran through a canal that directed all of the nasty water from downtown directly back into the aquifer, which we then drew from for our drinking water supply. This project was designed to restore the sheet flow across the prairie and to treat the water in the process through a series of wetlands. So ultimately, one of the key points of this is that, again, when we think about connectivity and ecological function, we're thinking about both upland areas, such as the pollinator habitat example that Isabella provided, but also our riparian corridors and networks. And this is just a good example of an effort to do that using a series of projects throughout that network. Finally, and I think this is our last slide, so we're probably a tiny bit ahead of time. We have a number as a center, a lot of work that we're doing, obviously, and the center is almost entirely funded by grants and external funding. We receive a very small portion of our funding actually from the university. So, we are constantly working with external partners on applied research projects to try to address real world project problems and needs across a range of scales. And as part of that, within this specific area that we're talking about today, we have a number of ongoing research priorities that we're working to address. And this is not all inclusive. This is just an example, but some of these include expanding on the information that Isabella was discussing earlier to provide additional guidance about how we design and develop within existing urban areas, but how we also manage land use within areas outside of core development and cities within that rural to urban interface. And one of the cores that Isabella mentioned is that thinking about appropriate location for more intensive land use is a key starting point. All of the other things in terms of low impact development and green stormwater infrastructure are extremely important and also a key part of that. But ultimately, we have to be developing and locating our intensive land uses in the appropriate location to minimize impacts on ecological networks and connectivity. We also focus on climate-wise and resilient landscapes, both at a small site scale, but also at a community level. Urban ecological connectivity and habitat planning, human conservation co-benefit opportunities and design. What that means is like, what are the things, and this is the Sweetwater Branch watershed projects are a great example of that. Where can we do something that has an important conservation value, but it's also providing an important and clear benefit to humans? Because I would argue that most conservation has some sort of human benefit. It may just not necessarily be immediately obvious, but we're looking at where are the best places that provide co-benefits for both humans and wildlife and still protect our conservation priorities and values. And that includes number 5, which has become a major focus for the center over the past several years, which is specifically looking at linear infrastructure, including roads and trails, and how we design and locate those trails. Where is it appropriate to locate trails within areas that are also being used to, protected for conservation value? And where should we be avoiding locating trails because we want to protect the conservation resources, or we want to maximize the experience of the trail users, or, for other reasons? So that's also become a big part of what we do. And just to go back to the beginning, we're always interested in looking for opportunities for collaboration and partnerships. As Isabella mentioned, we work closely with the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, UF-IFAS, the Center for Land Use Efficiency. These are all key centers and institutes within the University of Florida, but we also work closely with professional practitioners and outside partners. And so we're happy to respond or to discuss further any questions that you have, either as part of this webinar or after the fact. So thank you. And Jan, I'll turn it back over to you, I think.
Great, thank you. We have a few questions. That was a really wonderful presentation. And as we speak, I'm getting more and more questions. So let me start here. This is kind of maybe a meta question, but how do you measure success of corridors at different scales?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can take a stab, and Isabella, you could add into that if you want. I had the advantage of being able to preview some of the questions while Isabella was talking. So I had the moment to think about this for a minute. We'll see whether that pays off or not. But I would say that the question of scale is a great question. The first thing that I thought about generally was that when we're kind of measuring success, well, the easy answer is acres of land protected, right? Of high priority landscapes protected. Now, how we define high priority is another question. Is it a high priority because it provides significant habitat for focal species, endangered, threatened, or other focal species within the state? It might also include protection of significant watersheds, areas where water is flowing into significant surface waters like rivers or lakes or streams. It might also include wetland protection. If we take a piece of land and we're saying we want to quantify how useful this was, well, how many acres of wetlands were protected? That's another way that we could think about it. And we can, of course, also measure success based on economic values, thinking about rural lands and economies. Are we maintaining rural agricultural land uses? Are we maintaining silvicultural timber, natural forests? We can measure all of these things to show the benefit and the value of land protection. But when we dig down to that finer scale, like what Isabella and I were talking about as examples, we can also measure runoff reduction, and we can also measure nutrient reduction. We can do species like counts, like we could do a biodiversity account, within a specific plot of land to see whether we were able to increase pollinator biodiversity. So there's different ways at different scales. And Isabella, I'll let you add into that too.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer, and I'm glad you were able to preview some of the questions. I think that the only thing to add to that is, the measure of how wildlife traverses landscapes that we've, protected as corridor is another method that us within our linear infrastructure program are working to do, as well as many of our partners. I think about in our linear infrastructure program, the study of bear movement within the Ocala to Osceola region is a kind of hot topic right now, as well as, we look about into, areas that have been preserved for the corridor that with more investigation, there's the realization that certain species, like say the Florida grasshopper sparrow, are present that we didn't realize were originally there before. And for that, if you don't know the Florida grasshopper sparrow, that's a critically endangered species that's only, native here and needs a very specific type of ranch and prairie ecosystem. So that's an example of why our working in rural lands just outside of, say, the urban matrix, but still within that rural to urban fringe is really important for preservation and connectivity as well. So that's it's a broad answer, but it's, there's so many different methods really in thinking about where you are within that urban to rural transect, and also the scale you're thinking about too, and the specific system, whether it's upland or riparian.
Great, thank you. Michael, since you were able to preview some of the questions, are there any that you'd really like to answer?
Oh, well, I can leave that to you, Jen, if you want. I
Okay.
didn't, and they're still popping up, so I'm
Yes,
not
they
like
are.
able to preview all of them. Like it's happening too fast.
Let's see if there's a good one here. Let's try this one. They said this is a great presentation. Thank you so much for your work. How do you recommend an existing HOA neighborhood or community develop a comprehensive plan where these priorities weren't identified 50 years ago, but we understand there's a need to improve water infrastructure, restore tree canopies, and inventory native and keystone species? What resources for partnerships can you point to? They just say Brevard County, but in any county, are there resources that we can, regular people or professionals can tap into?
If you want, Mike, I can start with that. So I would say first and foremost, county-wise, every county has an IFAS extension office,
Yes.
which I know Jennifer and Rebecca can speak much more to. But they're a really, really wonderful resource, and I think they could honestly answer your question much more eloquently than Mike and I could about the specifics of your community. But when I think about existing HOAs and neighborhoods and communities, I think so much of it is about conversation. It's about, okay, is there an HOA community meeting where you can go and start raising some of these ideas or questions, and find other people that might be also interested in the concept, and kind of keep the energy going in that way. It all comes down to just starting the conversation and finding the right people to have the conversation with. And so I would say, yeah, if you are in an HOA, it's starting with those sorts of meetings. And then, beyond that, I think then for that resource of, okay, how do we actually begin a comprehensive plan, or what type of, projects should we consider? That's where reaching out to your IFAS extension officer would be, I think, a great next move.
Mike, did you have anything to add, or would you?
No, I think
Okay.
that's a great response. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Isabella, we have 67 counties and 67 offices, extension offices. So yeah, we really encourage you to contact your local office. They have amazing amazing resources that we do a lot more, I think, than people know. So and we take into consideration all of the research that Isabella and Michael have done, and all of the speakers that you've seen this year. We are a science-based organization, and we keep up on that information, as do all of the agents. So let's try this one. I believe you were talking about the state conservation plan. How do eastern urban areas like Miami, Broward, Dade, and Palm Beach figure into that conservation plan?
Yeah, I could start with that one if you want, Isabella. Um,
Sure.
so the person that really is the expert on this, our director Tom Hochter, is not on the call today, um, but from spending a lot of time with Tom, my understanding of that, and you can also get more information by going to our center website, where we've got viewers that show some of the layers that represent these state conservation priorities. So you can zoom in and out to Southeast Florida, see which layers show up and where some of these important areas are. But obviously, because of the intensity of development, they're not necessarily a core part of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network or the Florida Wildlife Corridor, especially the areas in the eastern parts of those counties. There are important western lands, of course, that are along the western, less developed, more agricultural parts of the counties. Um, but the other thing that I think is important to say is that even though that may be the case from a statewide or regional perspective, as Isabella discussed, within those specific, more dense urban environments, there are very explicit and individual conservation issues that are important to address. There are some very significant natural communities, for example, within Southeast Florida, pine rockland habitats, um, focal species that depend on those natural communities. They might be small, sort of remnant communities at this point, but they're still extremely important. So from an individual natural community or biodiversity or species scale, there may still be important areas. And of course, all of the factors that Isabella discussed in terms of urban green infrastructure and the values that it provides from a biodiversity perspective and stormwater management perspective definitely apply within those areas. There are also important coastal resiliency issues and coastal natural community management, mangrove forest, shoreline management, things that are important. So definitely important conservation and environmental issues that we want to be thinking about. Even though maybe from a statewide regional perspective, they have varying levels of importance from that in terms of the Florida wildlife corridor.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Let's see. What incentives are there for developers to maintain remnant forest tree preservation? Have you found anything that works?
Remnant forest tree preservation. There are some community, some grants for well, let's see. You said incentives to developers. One thing I was thinking about, Mike, is there's some grants for urban tree or urban forests uh, support or creation through the Forest Service and other like relevant grants. I know FDEP posts some for urban park development and nature-based recreation. But when I think about the incentives to developers, I don't know, Mike, if you have kind of any more pointed ideas.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think that probably important to state that this isn't necessarily an area that we focus on a day-to-day basis. It's not part of our expertise. There are forestry, there's a forestry program and faculty within the University of Florida. But from my experience, one of the key terms would be density, right? Like we can provide incentives to developers to increase their density within the developable portion of the site if they agree to protect XYZ. And those are obvious incentives because that means more units, potentially more units that they can sell or rentable area. And that's one of the things that we've seen within the city of Gainesville relative to historic preservation. Also, if you're agreed to protect this and restore this historic property as part of your site, well, you can increase density behind that property and build additional units. So I think that's at least one good example that's relevant to discuss.
Great, thank you. So it's
Mhm.
11 o'clock. I'd like to be respectful of people's time. Isabella, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything you'd like to end on? Or, I did put your email, or not your email, the link to your center in the chat box. And if anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to pass them along or check out the webpage. So I'm so happy that you were able to come today. Thank you so much for taking the time. Next week, again, everybody, it's the second week in December at 10 a.m. And it is Dr. Dave Clark speaking about his Coleus program. So again, thank you all. Isabella, Michael, thank you. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Thanks. Great questions.